Hey guys, welcome on today's journey, where we embark on how disgusting medieval sex life really was. When you think of the Middle Ages, you probably imagine knights in shining armor, castles towering over villages, and monks carefully copying manuscripts by candlelight. But beneath this world of kings and crusades was another story, one far more human, one that was whispered about in darkened chambers and judged harshly from the pulpit, and that is the story of medieval sex. A subject both fascinating and disgusting, filled with shocking restrictions, forbidden pleasures, bizarre superstitions, and uncomfortable truths that modern ears can scarcely believe. For while the church preached chastity and purity, ordinary people were finding ways to satisfy their desires in ways that would make most of us cringe today. And in this video we are going to peel back the curtain of time to explore the hidden, the shameful, and the downright disgusting truth about medieval sex life, a journey that will leave you both horrified and amazed at just how strange the past really was. So, let's begin. The medieval world was drenched in religion, and when it came to sex, no authority was louder, stricter, or more ever-present than the church, which saw itself as the guardian of souls and the ultimate judge of sin. And in the church's view, intercourse was not simply a private act between two people, but a moral battleground where heaven and hell wrestled over the fate of humanity. For while God had created sex to ensure the continuation of mankind, the pleasure attached to it was considered dangerous, even poisonous, a temptation planted by the devil to pull the faithful away from purity. And so from the pulpit, in monasteries, in confessions, and even in the dusty pages of canon law, the message was clear. Sex was sinful unless tightly controlled, and in practice, that meant it was only permitted within the narrow confines of marriage, and even then it was not about enjoyment, but about duty, about producing children and fulfilling what clerics called the marital debt. The very language of sin crept into how sex was described. Preachers thundered about lust, which they declared one of the deadly sins, and lust was considered so powerful that even married couples could find themselves sliding into damnation if they enjoyed their intimacy. Too much so manuals were written to guide confessors on how to question their parishioners about sexual behavior. And the questions were disturbingly detailed, almost voyeuristic, prying into when, how often, and in what manner men and women had lain together, because the church believed that even in marriage, sex could be corrupted by excessive desire, by unnatural positions, or by engaging on the wrong days, and there were a shocking number of forbidden days. For the calendar of the medieval Christian year was filled with fasts, feasts, and holy times during which sexual relations were forbidden, and if a couple obeyed every rule, they would find themselves abstaining for nearly half the year, including during Advent, Lent Sundays, Fridays, and on the eves of major feast days. Meaning that the rhythm of life was not just ruled by the ringing of church bells, but by a long list of no-sex days that loomed over every bedchamber. The church's obsession went even further, classifying some acts as mortal sins, enough to send a soul straight to hell if not confessed, while others were venial, lesser, but still shameful. And texts such as penitential handbooks for priests went into explicit detail about what was considered acceptable and what was forbidden, and to modern readers they make for both shocking and strangely clinical reading, for they rank scenes by severity, attaching penances such as fasting on bread and water for weeks, long pilgrimages, or public humiliation, all because someone had committed a sexual act deemed unnatural. To the medieval mind, unnatural was a broad category that included everything from sodomy to oral sex, to positions other than the so-called missionary, which was considered the only proper way, because it imitated the natural order. The man above, the woman below, as God intended. And even then priests warned couples not to linger in pleasure, but to get the business done and move on. Sex outside of marriage, meanwhile, was treated with absolute horror. Fornication between unmarried people was condemned. Adultery was seen as both a sin and a crime that could tear apart families and communities. And worst of all, was clerical celibacy being broken. For a priest caught with a lover was not only shamed, but often removed from office. His fall seen as the corruption of the sacred itself. And yet, despite all these restrictions, the church could not stop people from being human, from desiring and seeking intimacy, and so much of medieval life existed in tension between what the clergy thundered from the pulpits and what ordinary men and women actually did. When no one was watching, a tension that filled confessionals with shame, that drove people to whisper their sins in hushed voices, and that made sexuality one of the most heavily policed aspects of daily life. The most disturbing part of this was not only the rules, but the sheer level of surveillance. In small villages, priests knew everyone and confession was mandatory, meaning that people were forced to reveal their most private thoughts, desires, and actions, or risk their eternal soul, and this created a culture of guilt where even innocent desires could be twisted into sin in the mind of the penitent. Yet the clergy's writings reveal a dark irony, for in their attempts to control and suppress sex, They ended up cataloging it in astonishing detail, leaving behind for us lists of sins, punishments, and prohibitions that paint a vivid picture of just how much energy was spent obsessing over the bedroom. To understand medieval sex life, then, one must first understand this suffocating religious framework, for it was the backdrop against which everything else played out, from marriage customs to prostitution to the strange remedies and taboos surrounding fertility. And it is here, in the Church's endless war against lust, that the story truly begins, a story that shows us how the Middle Ages were not only about knights and castles, but about a society where desire was feared, where sex was hidden in shadow, and where sin was never more than a heartbeat away. Marriage in the medieval world was not primarily about love, passion, or even companionship, but about duty, obligation, and survival. And when it came to sex within marriage, the Church imposed a strange and rigid logic known as the marital debt, a concept that transformed intimacy into a form of obligation, almost a contract, where each partner owed the other conjugal rights, and this debt was so important that refusing to fulfill it without good reason could be considered sinful, even grounds for annulment in extreme cases, because the Church feared that denial of sex would lead to temptation, infidelity, and ultimately damnation. And so the bedroom was regulated not just by desire but by law, custom, and theology, with priests and jurists weighing in on how often couples should lie together, when they could not, and what their intentions ought to be. Marriage itself was rarely a matter of personal choice, for families arranged unions to consolidate land, wealth, and alliances, and so many men and women entered wedlock with partners they barely knew, carrying with them expectations laid down by parents, priests, and neighbors, not their own hearts. And in such unions, sex was framed as a duty first and foremost. The wife owed her body to her husband, the husband owed his seed to his wife, and together they owed children to society and to God. Manuals and sermons described marriage as a safeguard against lust, a necessary concession to human weakness, for while celibacy was considered the highest spiritual state, it was unrealistic for most of humanity. And so marriage became the next best thing, a means of channeling sinful desire into something productive, namely procreation. But even within this structure, strict rules remained. For sex in marriage was only truly virtuous if its purpose was to create children, and pleasure for its own sake was treated with suspicion, if not outright condemnation. It was a bizarre paradox. Couples were told they must not refuse one another, that sex was an obligation, and yet they were also told that to enjoy it too much was to risk sin, leaving men and women walking a tightrope where they were expected to fulfill the marital debt, while guarding themselves against the fires of lust that supposedly lurked behind every kiss and caress. This tension shaped the very rhythm of married life, with couples constantly negotiating between duty and desire, between what their hearts might want and what the Church demanded. And it created situations where intimacy could become mechanical, almost transactional, a box to tick rather than a shared act of love. And while some partners undoubtedly found real closeness in marriage, many others likely endured it as one more burden in a life already filled with labor, hardship, and religious guilt. The rules around marriage were not merely spiritual but legal and social. For a marriage was not valid until it had been consummated, meaning sex was not only expected, but required, and failure to perform could result in annulment, scandal, and shame, so much so that on some occasions, witnesses were even present on the wedding night to ensure the union had been sealed. An intrusion into privacy that to modern minds seems unthinkable, but in the medieval world, was part of how communities and families ensured legitimacy of heirs, property rights, and alliances. For women especially, the marital debt was a heavy burden, for they were expected to submit to their husbands regardless of their own feelings. Their bodies treated as vessels for procreation, their consent legally secondary to the needs of the marriage. And yet paradoxically, the Church sometimes defended wives by insisting that husbands, too, owed the marital debt, meaning a man could not withhold intimacy without committing a sin himself. And in this way, the idea of mutual obligation gave women at least a tiny foothold of power, a theological weapon they could wield against neglectful or straying husbands. But the idea of marital duty went even further, dictating not just that sex must happen, but how it must happen. And here again, the rules were strict. Positions outside the missionary were condemned as unnatural, acts of pleasure beyond vaginal intercourse were forbidden, and anything that deliberately avoided the chance of conception was labeled sinful. And yet, despite these endless restrictions, married couples still found ways to navigate, to carve out small spaces of intimacy within the suffocating framework imposed on them, though almost always under the shadow of guilt, penance, and the fear of sin. Even the timing of sex within marriage was micromanaged, with couples warned not to lie together during menstruation, pregnancy, or immediately after childbirth, nor during fast days, Sundays, or holy seasons. meaning that the calendar of the church hung over every marriage bed like an ever-watchful eye, stripping spontaneity and joy from what was already a heavily burdened duty. The concept of the marital debt also extended beyond the bedroom, shaping gender roles and expectations throughout daily life. Wives were instructed to be obedient, submissive, and fertile, while husbands were told to be protectors, providers, and moral guides, though in practice, these ideals often clashed with reality as poverty, illness, war, and personal temperaments shaped marriages in countless unpredictable ways. For noble families, marriage was a political tool, its sexual duties a means to produce heirs who would secure dynasties, while for peasants, it was a practical partnership, a pooling of labor, resources, and children to ensure survival. But in both cases, the marital bed remained central, the place where the union was both consummated and perpetually renewed, a private act with enormous public and spiritual consequences. And yet, behind all the rigid rules and sermons, we can still catch glimpses of the human side of marriage in the Middle Ages, of couples who, despite the guilt heaped upon them, found joy and closeness in one another, of husbands and wives who defied or quietly ignored the rules, of whispered laughter, stolen touches, and shared warmth that the church could never fully suppress. Still, for most, marriage was a duty first and a relationship second, and sex was framed as part of that duty, not an act of love, but an obligation owed, a debt to be paid, a ritual that bound men and women together under the watchful eyes of both God and community. And in that framework, desire was always tinged with danger, intimacy always haunted by guilt, and the marital bed always shadowed by the looming presence of sin. If marriage was supposed to contain desire within duty, then adultery was the crack in the wall, the forbidden temptation that both terrified and fascinated medieval society. For while the church thundered endlessly about the sin of unfaithfulness, and while law codes prescribed punishments ranging from fines to mutilation, human desire is not so easily bound, and behind the facade of piety, adultery was both a reality and a scandal. Whispered about in village gossip, immortalized in court records, and even sung of in bawdy ballads. For women, adultery was considered especially dangerous, for a wife's infidelity threatened not just morality but property, inheritance, and the legitimacy of heirs. And so punishments were harsher for women than for men, reflecting the double standard that ran like a deep vein through medieval sexual culture. A woman accused of adultery could be humiliated in public, shorn of her hair, forced to walk through the streets in shame, or even cast out entirely, while men often faced only symbolic penalties, unless their actions dishonored another noble household, in which case violence, duels, or feuds might erupt. Yet despite the threats of hellfire and punishment, adultery was not uncommon, for marriages were often arranged and loveless. Partners separated by war, pilgrimage, or trade, and opportunities abounded in a world where servants, neighbors, and strangers crossed paths daily in tight-knit communities. The literature of the Middle Ages reflects this reality. Troubadour poetry celebrated illicit passion, courtly love tales glamorized the married lady in her gallant knight, and even in moralizing sermons, priests admitted the ever-present danger of wandering desire, warning husbands to guard their wives and wives to guard their chastity. But beyond the romance of literature, there was the gritty reality of urban life, and nowhere did forbidden pleasures flourish more openly than in the realm of prostitution, which the church denounced, yet society tolerated, regulated, and even profited from. Medieval towns often had designated brothel districts, sometimes operated directly under municipal control, with rules governing prices, cleanliness, and working conditions. For civic leaders reasoned that prostitution, though sinful, was a necessary evil, a way to contain male lust and prevent worse crimes, such as rape or adultery. St. Augustine himself had argued centuries earlier that to abolish prostitution entirely would unleash chaos, and so the paradox persisted. Prostitutes were condemned as sinners, yet treated as a social safety valve, tolerated as long as they stayed within their quarters and did not disrupt the social order. Women who entered this trade did so for many reasons: poverty, abandonment, desperation, or sometimes simply the lack of any other means to survive, and, while some managed to carve out modest independence, many lived harsh lives on the margins, subject to exploitation, disease, and scorn. Seen as both useful and dangerous, desired yet despised, court records across Europe are filled with references to brothel fights, arrests of sex workers for stepping outside regulated zones, and disputes over payments, all revealing the bustling underworld of medieval sexuality that lay just beneath the surface of pious sermons and sacred rituals. Yet prostitution was not confined only to the lower classes. Noble courts too had their scandals, and kings themselves were notorious for keeping mistresses often openly, even while their queens were expected to embody virtue and fidelity, a contradiction that further highlights how differently male and female sexuality was judged. The Church, for its part, condemned both adultery and prostitution as mortal sins, yet its response was often inconsistent, for while preachers railed against immorality, some bishops collected taxes from brothels and monasteries, sometimes owned the very land on which red light districts operated, profiting from the sins they officially opposed. Meanwhile, popular imagination was captivated by scandal. For stories of lust, betrayal, and secret affairs spread rapidly through rumor, song, and tale, and the medieval world's appetite for gossip was as insatiable as our own. Adultery trials drew crowds, bawdy poems circulated in marketplaces, and satires lampooned priests and nuns for breaking their vows of chastity. For even within the cloisters, human desire refused to stay silent. Indeed, the records of ecclesiastical courts reveal case after case of clerics caught in affairs of nuns, secretly bearing children of abbots accused of keeping concubines, all of which fed the perception that the very guardians of morality were themselves vulnerable to the sins they condemned. For ordinary people, scandals provided both entertainment and warning, a way to mock the mighty and reinforced community boundaries, for the shame of public exposure was often punishment enough, and the medieval world was merciless in its love of spectacle. Even so, many affairs likely remained hidden, concealed behind closed doors, never recorded in court or sermon, only hinted at in the sudden appearance of an oddly familiar-looking child, or in the whispers that passed around a village fire. To modern eyes, the contradictions of medieval sexuality, condemning desire, yet feeding off its scandals, banning prostitution, yet licensing brothels, punishing women, yet excusing men, may seem hypocritical, but to the people of the time, they were simply the lived reality of a world caught between the lofty ideals of faith and the unyielding power of human appetite. Adultery, prostitution, and scandal revealed that beneath the Church's iron grip on morality, medieval society was far more complicated, messy, and human than its sermons allowed. A place where forbidden pleasures thrived even under constant threat, and where the struggle between desire and duty defined not just the bedroom, but the very structure of society itself. In the medieval mind, sex was never quite divorced from the machinery of survival. Children were both a blessing and a burden, a sign of God's favor and a financial necessity in a world where labor was lifeblood. And yet, even amid this pragmatic view, fear of unwanted pregnancy and of infertility shaped daily life in ways that might seem strange, even shocking, to us today. Medieval people did not have our modern understanding of conception or contraception. Instead, they relied on a patchwork of folk wisdom, herbal remedies, and superstition. Women would drink potions made from plants like pennyroyal, rue, or silphiform, a now extinct plant prized for its contraceptive properties. Some methods were literal gambles. Suppositories of crushed seeds, ointments of mercury or opium, and even magical charms woven into clothing or hidden beneath beds. The line between medicine, superstition, and ritual was almost invisible. The fear of sterility, whether male or female, loomed large. Infertility was not simply a personal disappointment, it could be seen as a divine punishment, a blemish on a marriage, or even a curse from envious neighbors or witches. Doctors, clergy, and midwives all offered guidance, often conflicting, about how to ensure fertility. Recipes for fertility aids could involve everything from eating certain animal organs to reciting prayers at sunrise, sometimes in combination. These remedies were as much about psychological reassurance as biological efficacy, though some, like certain herbs, may have had real, if unpredictable, effects. Men, too, faced anxieties about potency. A husband unable to satisfy the marital debt or produce heirs risked social shame, legal consequences, and sometimes even accusations of impotence as a moral failing. Medical treatises of the period recorded elaborate methods to restore virility, diet, bathing, bloodletting, and concoctions brewed from exotic ingredients imported at great cost. These texts could read like medieval self-help manuals, mixing practical advice with fantastical remedies. The humor theory dominated medieval medicine, too. A man's seed was thought to be a distillation of his vital fluids, and a woman's womb, a delicate temperamental vessel. Pregnancy could be deleterious, prevented through diet, exercise, and complex rituals designed to balance the humors. A clumsy word, a poorly timed bath, or even the wrong emotion could, in theory, render conception impossible. And if a child did not come, fingers would point, guilt would mount, and fear would fester in hushed whispers behind closed doors. Yet despite these fears, medieval people remained surprisingly inventive. Contraception, however unreliable, was a constant topic in manuscripts, advice books, and letters between couples. The quest to control fertility was a balancing act between God's will, natural law, and human desire, between superstition and budding science, between hope and dread. In a world where each pregnancy could be life-threatening for the mother, And where inheritance and survival hinged on producing heirs, birth control was not merely convenience, it was a matter of survival, a private, often desperate, attempt to wrest some control over a world dominated by uncertainty, fear, and the unyielding demands of society and faith. In the medieval world, the act of adultery was far more than a breach of trust or a moral failing. It was a crime, a sin, and a social disruption all rolled into one. For men and women alike, infidelity carried consequences that were moral, legal, and sometimes brutally physical. Yet, despite the constant threat of punishment, temptation was everywhere, and human desire rarely conformed neatly to rules or expectations. The tension between what was forbidden and what was irresistible created a world in which secrecy, scandal, and shame were as integral to social life as religion or work. The medieval church was relentless in its condemnation of sexual transgression. Sex outside the bonds of marriage, especially when it threatened the sanctity of inheritance or family, was considered a grievous sin. Confession manuals, the guidebooks of clergy, offered meticulous instructions on how to judge and quantify sins. They listed not only the act itself, but the circumstances, where it occurred, how many times, with what intent, and even the relative guilt of each participant. A peasant sneaking into a neighbor's bed and a nobleman seducing a lady of the court were both sins, though the social repercussions could not have been more different. The punishments for adultery were harsh, yet inconsistent, reflecting the interplay of social status, gender, and local custom. For peasants and townsfolk, exposure could mean public humiliation, fines, or corporal punishment. Medieval courts might order a guilty woman to stand in the town square, bareheaded and barefoot, wearing a sign declaring her transgression. Men might be whipped, or in some cases forced to perform penance before the community. Among the nobility, however, the rules were more flexible or at least more negotiable. Powerful men often escaped physical punishment entirely, relying instead on social maneuvering, bribes, or simply their ability to charm and intimidate witnesses. Women of higher status, on the other hand, were rarely spared. Their infidelity threatened dynastic stability, inheritance lines, and political alliances, making them vulnerable to exile, imprisonment, or marriage annulments. Despite the severity of these punishments, adultery was widespread. Human desire rarely respected the rigid moral frameworks imposed by the church or society. Letters, diaries, and court records reveal a world teeming with secret trysts, clandestine meetings, and whispered confessions. Noblemen often maintained mistresses openly or discreetly, sometimes even with the tacit approval of their wives, provided the arrangement did not interfere with legitimate heirs. Among peasants and townsfolk, affairs were usually conducted in the shadows, in the barns and lofts of farms, in the woods outside town walls, or under the cover of night in narrow, winding streets. The tension between public morality and private behavior created an environment of surveillance, rumor, and fear. Communities were close-knit, and any perceived scandal spread quickly. Neighbors, servants, and local clergy all acted as unwitting enforcers of social norms, reporting indiscretions that might otherwise have remained secret. In some towns, officials even established a kind of moral police, patrolling streets and marketplaces to catch lovers in the act. Public shaming rituals were designed to instill both punishment and warning, transforming individual desire into a spectacle of communal discipline. Gender played a decisive role in the medieval response to adultery. Men's infidelities were often tolerated or even celebrated, particularly if they occurred outside marriage and involved women of lower social rank. Women, however, bore a disproportionate share of the blame. Their sexual conduct was tightly policed because it directly affected lineage, inheritance, and family honor. A woman who engaged in extramarital sex risked being ostracized, disinherited, or forced into cloistered life. In some regions, adultery could even result in death for the woman, while the male counterpart faced minimal consequence. This glaring double standard highlights the gendered power dynamics of medieval society, where male desire was often excused, and female autonomy severely constrained. The Church's involvement in regulating sexual behavior extended beyond punishment. Religious teachings permeated daily life, shaping attitudes toward temptation and desire. Sermons repeatedly warned of the dangers of lust, portraying adultery as a sin that endangered not just the individual but the soul itself. Confession became a tool for social control, requiring the penitent to reveal intimate details of their sexual life, often in a manner that blurred the line between spiritual guidance and invasive policing. Clergy would ask probing questions: how many times, with whom, under what circumstances? The meticulous nature of these inquiries reflects the deep anxiety medieval society felt about sexual morality and the control of desire. Scandal and gossip were inseparable from adultery. Chronicles and letters from the period are filled with stories of noble affairs that rocked courts and kingdoms. Kings and dukes engaged in affairs that influenced political alliances, marriages, and territorial claims. Mistresses sometimes wielded astonishing influence, guiding the decisions of powerful men or securing positions for their children. Yet these liaisons were fraught with risk. If discovered, the consequences could be catastrophic, from public humiliation to imprisonment or execution. Among commoners, scandal often resulted in less lethal but equally painful consequences: ostracism, loss of employment, or public penance that branded the guilty party as morally corrupt. The methods of enforcing sexual morality were diverse and often cruel. In some areas, the community itself carried out punishment, dragging adulterers before the town square to perform humiliating acts. Sometimes with symbolic implements, bells hung around the neck, barrels rolled through the streets, or hair shorn as a mark of shame. Legal codes in other regions prescribed fines, corporal punishment, or forced labor for both parties, though women frequently bore the brunt of these penalties. Clerical courts added their own layer of enforcement, demanding penance, pilgrimage, or even vows of chastity, turning adultery into a spiritual trial as much as a social or legal one. Despite these harsh measures, human nature persisted. The allure of forbidden love, the excitement of secrecy, and the intense intimacy of illicit encounters ensured that adultery continued to flourish. In monasteries and convents, where vows of chastity were supposed to reign supreme, records show countless instances of sexual transgression. Monks and nuns were not immune to desire, and clandestine liaisons within cloisters were surprisingly common, often resulting in pregnancies, secret marriages, or severe punishments once discovered. These hidden lives remind us that medieval morality, while rigidly preached, was always negotiated in practice. The medieval obsession with adultery also intersected with the legal concept of honor. Women's fidelity was directly tied to family reputation, while men's honor was measured more by public conduct and martial prowess. A single act of female infidelity could tarnish a family's standing for generations, affecting marriage prospects, social alliances, and economic arrangements. This intense social pressure ensured that adultery was not merely a private sin. It was a communal concern, a matter of public order, and a threat to the delicate equilibrium of medieval life. Scandal, secrecy, and punishment created a cycle in which desire, fear, and regulation were perpetually intertwined. The medieval imagination was saturated with stories of betrayal, jealousy, and illicit passion. These tales were not mere entertainment. They were warnings, moral lessons, and cautionary examples for the community. Literature, theater, and song often dramatized adultery, emphasizing the peril of succumbing to temptation, the inevitability of discovery, and the consequences of moral failure. Yet paradoxically, the very popularity of these stories indicates a society fascinated by the very behavior it condemned. Ultimately, adultery in the medieval world reveals a society caught between human desire and social control. It was a sin, a scandal, and a spectacle, policed by religion, law, and community, yet endlessly repeated in secret. Men and women navigated this fraught landscape with ingenuity, discretion, and sometimes reckless abandon. They sought pleasure, asserted autonomy, and tested boundaries, all while knowing that discovery could bring humiliation, punishment, or even death. In the quiet corners of towns and villages, in the hidden chambers of noble castles, and even within the cloisters of monasteries, adultery persisted as a shadowy but undeniable aspect of life. It was a reminder that human desire cannot be fully contained by rules or moral injunctions, no matter how strictly enforced. The medieval world, with its intricate codes of behavior, public punishments, and moral teachings, was in constant tension with the fundamental impulses of the human heart. And it is in this tension between sin and obligation, secrecy and punishment, desire and fear that the true, often disturbing, texture of medieval sexual life emerges. Adultery was never merely an act of passion. It was a mirror of society's anxieties, a measure of social order, and a testament to the enduring power of human desire. In its punishments and scandals, we see the lengths to which communities would go to enforce norms. In its persistence, we see the inevitability of human behavior in the face of repression. And in the stories, confessions, and trials that survive to this day, we are offered a glimpse into a world where the line between sin and survival, temptation and regulation, was perpetually, and often dangerously, blurred. Prostitution in the medieval world occupied a strange, uneasy place between necessity and sin. The church condemned it relentlessly, moralists railed against it, and yet it was tolerated, sometimes even regulated, because authorities understood that desire could not be eradicated. In towns, cities, and even some rural communities, sex work existed as a fixture of life, a grimly practical outlet for human desire that could not be fully controlled. It was, in a sense, both vilified and acknowledged, a necessary evil that revealed much about medieval attitudes toward the body morality, and control. The existence of prostitutes was rarely denied. Rather, they were formally constrained, segregated, and taxed. City authorities recognized that allowing sex work in the shadows could be more dangerous than permitting it under supervision. Hence, brothels emerged as a semi-legal solution to what was seen as a permanent human problem. In places like Paris, London, and Florence, brothels were established under municipal oversight. They were licensed, monitored, and sometimes taxed, with the profits often going to the town coffers. Women who worked in these establishments had to live under strict rules. Specific areas where they could operate, limits on whom they could serve, and even regulations on attire to mark their occupation clearly to the public. Despite this apparent regulation, life as a medieval prostitute was harsh. Women in the trade were socially marginalized, vulnerable to disease, and subject to frequent abuse, both physical and financial. Some were independent, but many were forced into the work by poverty, debt, or coercion. Once within the system, escape was difficult. Laws often prohibited other trades for known prostitutes, effectively trapping them in the work that society demanded but morally condemned. Yet, in the paradoxical logic of the time, their presence was tolerated because they served a social function, absorbing male desire and protecting respectable women from sexual transgression. The Church's stance on prostitution was equally paradoxical. Clergy condemned it as sinful and degrading, yet theologians such as St. Augustine argued that it served a practical purpose. By providing an outlet for lust, prostitution supposedly prevented greater sins, such as adultery or rape. Some moralists even suggested that brothels, unsavory though they were, preserved the moral order by containing vice in designated areas rather than letting it spread unchecked. The Church, in practice, walked a delicate line, preaching against the sin while tacitly accepting that it was impossible to eradicate human desire entirely. Brothels varied widely depending on location, class, and time period. In some cities, they were simple houses with minimal furnishings, often cramped and unsanitary, with shared sleeping quarters and little privacy. In wealthier urban areas, however, some brothels catered to affluent clients, offering more comfort, better food, and even entertainment. Prostitutes in these establishments were sometimes able to achieve a degree of economic independence, though it came at the cost of moral condemnation and the constant threat of disease or legal harassment. Across the spectrum, hygiene was poor, medicine was rudimentary, and venereal disease was a constant companion. Venereal disease, in particular, shaped medieval perceptions of prostitution. Sex work was associated with sickness, corruption, and moral decay, reinforcing the stigma attached to it. Remedies were largely ineffective and often absurd by modern standards, ranging from herbal poultices to prayers, charms, and ritual baths. Public health measures were primitive at best. Some towns attempted to segregate infected women, while others relied on the hope that divine intervention would curb the spread of disease. The reality, however, was grim. Prostitution, disease, and poverty were deeply intertwined, creating cycles that were nearly impossible to break. Prostitution also reflected the rigid social hierarchy of the time. Nobles might visit brothels openly, sometimes without social repercussion, while commoners risked both legal penalties and public shame. If caught consorting with sex workers outside sanctioned areas, women of higher status were rarely involved, as their honor was tightly policed, yet the nobility could exploit lower-class women with impunity. This dynamic reinforced social divisions, demonstrating that sexual vice was tolerated more readily in the powerful than in the powerless. Despite the harsh conditions, prostitutes developed their own subcultures, networks, and strategies for survival. They shared knowledge about clients, avoided violent encounters, and sometimes formed alliances for protection. In urban centers, sex work was not entirely invisible. Women could gain a degree of autonomy and even wield social influence in subtle ways. Brothels became hubs of rumor, information exchange, and negotiation, connecting the margins of society in ways few other institutions could. In this sense, the medieval brothel was not merely a site of sin, it was a space where the rules of the outside world were partially suspended, a liminal zone of negotiation between desire, danger, and survival. Regulation was a persistent theme. Authorities often imposed curfews, mandatory registration, or physical markings to identify prostitutes. In some Italian city-states, women were required to wear distinctive clothing, hats, or badges to signify their profession. Town records show frequent inspections, fines for rule-breaking, and even imprisonment for those who violated curfews. Yet enforcement was inconsistent, and bribery or influence could often circumvent the strictest measures. These regulations reveal a society both fascinated and terrified by sexual vice, attempting to balance moral panic with pragmatic necessity. Religion continued to loom over every aspect of sex work. Confession and penance were theoretically available to prostitutes, though in practice, the stigma of their occupation made genuine spiritual reconciliation difficult. Sermons warned women of eternal damnation if they persisted in their trade, while simultaneously acknowledging that male patrons were unlikely to change their behavior. This moral double bind reinforced the precarious position of women in the profession, condemned for meeting needs that men openly pursued, yet marginalized if they sought escape or redemption. The intersection of prostitution with broader cultural attitudes toward the body and intimacy is also notable. Medieval thought linked sexuality, health, and morality in ways that might seem bizarre today. Women's bodies were considered inherently dangerous and seductive, while male desire was portrayed as uncontrollable and natural. In this framework, prostitutes were scapegoats, blamed for the sins of others while performing a socially sanctioned, if morally dubious, service. Brothels then became not only sites of pleasure, but also stages where societal anxieties about lust, power, and morality were played out in tangible form. Prostitution was not entirely hidden in literature and art either. Chronicles, poems, and moral treatises often depicted the lives of sex workers, sometimes with sympathy, sometimes with scorn. These depictions highlight the contradictions of medieval society: fascination and fear, reliance and condemnation, pleasure and punishment. In some cases, prostitutes were portrayed as clever, resourceful, and resilient, able to navigate a world stacked against them. In others, they were cautionary figures, emblematic of moral decay and divine punishment. Ultimately, the medieval brothel offers a window into a world where desire, necessity, and morality were entangled in ways that modern sensibilities might find shocking. It was a space of commerce and survival, sin and regulation, intimacy and danger. The women who worked there were at once vilified and essential, marginalized and economically significant. For men, brothels provided controlled outlets for desire, yet also reinforced a social hierarchy that protected the powerful while punishing the weak. In the end, prostitution in the medieval era was a microcosm of the broader tensions surrounding sex, morality, and society. It demonstrated the impossibility of fully suppressing desire, the relentless scrutiny of women's bodies, and the pragmatic compromises communities made to maintain social order. In these darkened rooms, amid the smells, disease, and occasional laughter, medieval life revealed itself in all its contradictions. Human, flawed, and uncomfortably real. To understand medieval sex, one cannot ignore the body itself, the human body, as it existed in the everyday life of the Middle Ages, and how its care, or lack thereof, shaped desire, intimacy, and disease. Modern viewers may picture romance, scented oils, and clean linens, but the truth is far grimmer. For most medieval people, the body was a source of discomfort, odor, and danger, and the act of sex took place within that unvarnished reality. Hygiene, by modern standards, was minimal. Regular bathing was rare, and water itself was sometimes considered harmful. Physicians and religious authorities warned that frequent immersion could weaken the body, or worse, open it to the intrusion of evil spirits. In many towns, public bathhouses existed but were often crowded, unclean, and morally suspect. Rumors of illicit sexual encounters were common. People who could afford private baths might bathe occasionally. But even then, the experience was far removed from the fragrant luxury of modern spas. For the majority, dirt, sweat, and the accumulation of bodily secretions were constants. Clothing compounded the problem. Medieval garments were heavy, layered, and infrequently washed. Wool, linen, and leather absorbed sweat and grime, making personal odor nearly inevitable. Underwear was minimal or non-existent for much of the period, and outer layers often went months without laundering. Lice, fleas, and other pests were pervasive, inhabiting hair, clothing, and bedding alike. These infestations were simply accepted as part of daily life, tolerated rather than eradicated, and they contributed to the general sense of bodily discomfort and uncleanliness. Sex in this environment was not a sanitized act, but a confrontation with the realities of human physiology. Bodily fluids were smelly and visible, the body was often unkempt, and disease lurked in every intimate encounter. Venereal disease was common, yet poorly understood, and infections could spread with terrifying speed. Treatment was largely ineffective, relying on herbs, potions, or prayers. Doctors lacked knowledge of bacteria or hygiene, so wounds and sores might fester, and the body itself became a vessel of both desire and danger. Attitudes toward the body were shaped by religion, superstition, and medical theory. Humoral theory dominated medicine, positing that health depended on the balance of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Sexual activity was thought to influence these humors, sometimes dangerously. For instance, excessive sexual indulgence could overheat the body, disturb the balance of humors, or even shorten life. The church layered this with moral concern. A filthy or diseased body reflected sin, and sexual desire itself was a perilous indulgence that could corrupt both body and soul. Even simple cleanliness was laborious. People might wash hands or faces daily, but full body washing was far less common. Sweat accumulated in folds of skin, hair grew untrimmed, and excrement, both human and animal, polluted streets and homes. This pervasive filth affected sexual activity. A couple might attempt intimacy in a crowded, stinking room, with vermin skittering around, and the very air could carry disease. The sensory experience of sex, the smell. The feel of grimy skin was often unpleasant, yet it was the unavoidable reality of life. Midwives, physicians, and alchemists developed remedies to counter these challenges, but their efficacy was limited. Herbs and potions promised to mask odors, repel disease, or increase virility, yet results were inconsistent. Rituals of purification, such as washing hands or sprinkling holy water, were often as much about moral reassurance as physical cleanliness. In some cases, sexual preparation included fumigation with smoke or the use of scented oils, but these measures were rare and largely confined to the wealthy. For most, sex was inseparable from the smells, stains, and bodily functions that modern culture would find revolting. The realities of filth also shaped gender dynamics. Women, already subject to moral scrutiny, were blamed for odors or signs of disease, while men's hygiene received less attention. The concept of modesty was tightly interwoven with these concerns. Uncleanliness was equated with moral weakness, and a smelly body could imply sin, laziness, or licentiousness. Women's value in marriage or courtship could be assessed not just by appearance, but by their ability to manage hygiene, an often impossible expectation given the environmental conditions. Sexual performance was affected by these factors as well. Pain, discomfort, and disease were common, and sexual activity could be physically exhausting or even dangerous. Venereal infections might cause visible sores, infertility, or systemic illness. Births were hazardous, sometimes resulting in maternal death, and the threat of pregnancy loomed over every sexual encounter. The body, in all its physical reality, imposed limits on desire, and sex was inseparable from the ever-present risks of illness and contamination. Filth also had cultural and symbolic significance. Dirt and disease were associated with sin, moral corruption, and the dangers of uncontrolled lust. Sex, already morally suspect, was further tainted by the unavoidable presence of the unclean body. Literature, sermons, and moral treatises often emphasized the grotesque aspects of the human form, warning that indulgence in desire could make one both spiritually and physically impure. Humor and satire were used to depict the body in unflattering terms, from smelly armpits to unwashed hair, reinforcing the link between physical filth and moral weakness. Yet, despite these barriers, intimacy persisted. Desire was resilient, adapting to grim realities. People found ways to experience pleasure, to bond, and to express affection even in environments rife with odor, disease, and discomfort. The human body, with all its imperfections, continued to be both a source of fascination and a site of vulnerability. Sexuality in the medieval era cannot be understood without acknowledging the omnipresent role of filth. It shaped practices, limited freedom, and intensified the moral weight of desire. The reality of medieval bodies also influenced broader societal attitudes. Public health, hygiene, and sexual morality were intertwined in ways that seem alien today. Disease was often moralized, with the body seen as a reflection of the soul, and cleanliness was as much spiritual as physical. Prostitutes, the sick, and the impoverished were stigmatized for their inevitable filth, reinforcing social hierarchies and moral judgments. Even within marriage, sex was colored by the realities of odor, sweat, and bodily weakness, a constant reminder that desire existed in an environment far removed from idealized romance. Ultimately, medieval intimacy was inseparable from the body's limitations. Desire, sin, pleasure, and risk coexisted in spaces that were often cramped, smelly, and disease-ridden. Hygiene was a luxury, disease a common companion, and the body itself a site of struggle. In this context, the act of sex was less a celebration of love and more a negotiation with the physical realities of existence. An intimate confrontation with the human form in all its flawed, fragile, and sometimes revolting detail. The grim reality of the medieval body reminds us that history was not sanitized. Men and women pursued intimacy within the constraints of dirt, odor, and disease. Hygiene or the lack thereof shaped sexual practices, social expectations, and moral judgment, creating an environment where desire was fraught with risk and pleasure was inseparable from danger. This chapter in medieval life forces a sobering reflection. The human body, for all its potential for passion, was also a site of struggle, repulsion, and vulnerability, and understanding this is essential to comprehending the true nature of sex in the Middle Ages. If hygiene and disease made medieval sex a physically fraught endeavor, the mind offered no respite. Desire, intimacy, and the mechanics of reproduction were interpreted through a lens of superstition, folklore, and peculiar medical theories. The medieval imagination was vivid, but often terrifyingly literal, filling the spaces of sexuality with demons, magic, and bizarre beliefs about how the human body worked. To understand medieval sexual life fully, one must explore not only what people did, but what they feared, imagined, and believed about sex, and the consequences of ignoring these beliefs could be catastrophic. A dominant framework for understanding sex was the medical theory of humors. Inherited from ancient Greece and Rome, men and women were thought to possess different balances of blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and these humors determined temperament, fertility, and sexual capacity. Sexual activity was considered an exchange of vital substances. The male seed and female menstrual blood or seed were thought to combine to create life. However, this understanding was riddled with misconceptions. Some believed that the female orgasm was necessary for conception. Theory derived from observations that women who did not experience pleasure often failed to conceive. Others thought that excessive female arousal could weaken a man, or that men's seed was limited and could be exhausted by repeated sexual activity. Magic and superstition were deeply entwined with these ideas. Love potions, charms, and talismans were common, and the promise of controlling desire or fertility through magic was alluring. A woman might drink a concoction of herbs to attract a lover or ensure conception, while men might carry charms to maintain potency or ward off impotence. Such remedies were part medical, part mystical, and part desperate. Without access to reliable contraception or reproductive science, people turned to any means that promised control over the uncertainties of sex and reproduction. Demons and spirits also populated the medieval imagination of sexuality. Incubi and succubi, male and female demons thought to attack sleepers, were blamed for nocturnal emissions, impotence, and unwanted pregnancies. A man waking in the night with a sexual experience might be told he had been assaulted by an incubus, while a woman experiencing erotic dreams could be accused of succubus influence. These beliefs were taken seriously, leading to exorcisms, charms, and sometimes even legal action if such encounters were considered morally or spiritually dangerous. The presence of these supernatural threats created anxiety around intimacy, especially for those who sought to satisfy marital or social obligations while avoiding sin. The fear of pollution was another common thread. Sexual fluids were seen as potent and potentially dangerous substances. Semen could corrupt the body if misused, and menstrual blood was frequently considered harmful or impure. Spells, talismans, and rituals were employed to control these fluids, to prevent infertility, or to protect against curses. Some remedies were practical, based on herbal medicine, while others were symbolic, invoking saints, angels, or mystical words. The line between superstition and medicine was blurred, and the human imagination filled in gaps with astonishing creativity, and, often with fear. Certain sexual practices were surrounded by, especially strange beliefs. Masturbation, for example, was often condemned not only as sinful, but as physically harmful. The loss of semen was thought to weaken the body, dry the brain, or shorten life. Similarly, nocturnal emissions or unintended pregnancies were sometimes interpreted as signs of moral failure, demonic influence, or imbalance of the humors. Even within marriage, the act of sex was fraught with these mental dangers. Pleasure could be sinful, desire could be dangerous, and misfortune could follow any transgression, intentional or not. Superstitions extended to fertility and conception in ways that seem absurd today. Couples might perform elaborate rituals to ensure pregnancy or prevent miscarriage. Sleeping with particular herbs under the pillow, engaging in sexual intercourse in specific positions, or timing sex according to lunar phases. Folk remedies abounded, some based on keen observation, others entirely fantastical. For instance, certain plants were thought to enhance virility, while others could supposedly prevent conception. Love and fertility were always mediated by mysterious forces, blending practical advice with mystical belief. Even the perception of the body itself was shaped by superstition. Genitalia and sexual behavior were interpreted symbolically. The size, shape, or color of body parts could predict fertility or moral character. Warts, boils, or unusual marks might be read as signs of sexual transgression or divine punishment. Physicians, clerics, and folk healers alike engaged in this symbolic reading of the body, creating a moralized and magical framework that made sexual life a complex web of fear, ritual, and expectation. These beliefs had real-world consequences. People lived under constant vigilance, both of their own desires and of the perceived threats surrounding them. An unmarried woman experiencing sexual desire might be accused of witchcraft if she fell ill or experienced misfortune. A man suffering from impotence could seek exorcisms, charms, or herbal remedies, sometimes with extreme physical consequences. Fear of divine punishment or demonic interference shaped choices about marriage, extramarital affairs, and even the timing and frequency of sexual activity. Desire was never purely personal. It was moral, spiritual, and sometimes cosmic in significance. Moreover, superstition influenced sexual morality and law. Authorities often criminalized acts considered unnatural, dangerous, or sinful, drawing on these mystical frameworks. Homosexuality, masturbation, and extramarital sex were condemned, not only on moral grounds, but as offenses that could disturb the balance of the humors, invite demonic attack, or endanger fertility. Punishments were severe, ranging from public shaming to execution, and they reflected a worldview in which sexual misbehavior had consequences far beyond the individual. Yet, despite or perhaps because of these fears, the human imagination flourished. Erotic literature, poetry, and art often explored the tension between desire and danger, sometimes incorporating superstition and magic. Troubadours, monks, and anonymous writers alike used fantastical imagery to describe love, lust, and sexual conquest. Some of these works are humorous, some tragic, but all reveal a society obsessed with understanding, controlling, and sometimes mocking the mysteries of sex. Medieval superstition also fostered secrecy and ingenuity. Couples might seek privacy not only to avoid moral censure, but to evade the imagined spiritual dangers surrounding intimacy. Hidden rituals, whispered prayers, and secret charms allowed desire to exist within a framework of fear. Magic and superstition, far from merely inhibiting sexual behavior, also created space for ingenuity and subtle rebellion, allowing people to negotiate pleasure and protection simultaneously. Ultimately, the medieval mind transformed sex into something more than a biological act. It was moral, mystical, and terrifying. Every encounter carried potential for pleasure, sin, disease, or demonic interference. Love, desire, and reproduction were never merely personal, they were entangled with cosmic forces, magical thinking, and a worldview that demanded constant vigilance. To modern eyes, these beliefs may seem absurd or grotesque, but for medieval people, they were real, tangible, and often terrifying. Understanding these superstitions is essential for grasping the medieval sexual experience. Physical intimacy existed in a world where demons could attack the unwary. Love potions promised both delight and danger, and the human body itself could betray its owner through disease, infertility, or imbalance of the humors. Pleasure was mediated by fear, and desire was inseparable from ritual, magic, and moral concern. In this environment, the act of sex was never simple. It was a negotiation with forces both visible and invisible, biological and spiritual, mundane and supernatural. In retrospect, the medieval obsession with superstition reveals a society struggling to comprehend human desire with the tools available to religion, folklore, and early science. It also shows the lengths to which people would go to exert control over the uncertainties of intimacy to protect themselves from moral, physical, and spiritual danger, and to navigate a world in which every sexual act carried potentially profound consequences. The strange beliefs and superstitions surrounding medieval sex remind us that desire was never purely private. It was entangled with cosmic significance, infused with magical thinking, and constantly under scrutiny. Incubi and succubi, love charms, herbal remedies, and humoral theory all created a landscape in which sex was as frightening as it was necessary, as imaginative as it was physical. Understanding these beliefs allows us to see the Middle Ages not as quaint or repressive in simple terms, but as a society where the imagination, the body, and the spirit collided in the most intimate of human acts. In the end, medieval superstition and strange beliefs show us that sexual life was never merely about pleasure or procreation. It was a constant negotiation with fear, magic, and the unknown, a delicate balancing act between desire and disaster. For men and women of the period, intimacy was always a risky endeavor, shadowed by moral, spiritual, and physical dangers that shaped behavior, limited freedom, and made the act of love profoundly complicated and sometimes terrifyingly strange. While superstition and ritual shaped the public perception of sex, the private realities of desire often took different forms. The medieval world was one of strict moral codes, reinforced by church law, social expectation, and fear of divine punishment. Yet human desire rarely conforms to rules, and many people lived secret lives in which their sexual feelings, orientations, and pleasures diverged sharply from what was publicly sanctioned. Exploring these hidden worlds reveals a side of medieval sexuality rarely seen in records of piety, law, or folklore. a world of forbidden lusts, clandestine relationships, and the quiet resilience of personal desire. Homosexuality, for instance, existed throughout medieval Europe, even as it was condemned as sodomy and punished severely. The church and secular authorities treated male homosexual acts as not merely immoral, but criminal, often equating them with heresy or invoking capital punishment. Yet, despite legal risks, same-sex desire persisted. Monks, soldiers, and townsmen engaged in secret liaisons, often concealed under the cloak of friendship or shared living arrangements. Male-male desire was sometimes discussed in explicit terms in literature, with coded references appearing in poetry, marginalia, and confessional manuals, suggesting that it was widespread even if rarely admitted publicly. Female homosexual relationships are less frequently documented, partly because medieval writers often erased or ignored women's sexual agency. Still, historical records, court cases, and occasional scandalous letters reveal that women, too, sought erotic intimacy with other women. Nuns, particularly those confined in convents, could develop intense emotional and sexual attachments, sometimes leading to forbidden encounters. The veil of religious devotion offered both a cover and a pressure cooker. Convents were places of spiritual aspiration, but also sites of secret desire, where suppression and longing coexisted. Clerical celibacy further complicated sexual lives. Monks and priests were bound by vows that forbade sexual activity, yet records of misconduct are plentiful. Some engaged in heterosexual relationships, fathering children, despite vows of chastity. Others pursued same-sex relationships, often discreetly but sometimes scandalously, leading to ecclesiastical trials and public humiliation. The tension between official morality and private behavior created a hidden sexual economy in which desire persisted in the shadows, shaped by opportunity, secrecy, and the human need for intimacy. Marriage, too, could conceal forbidden passions. Arranged unions, particularly among the nobility, frequently paired individuals with little regard for personal attraction. This mismatch sometimes drove spouses to seek fulfillment elsewhere, giving rise to clandestine affairs. Lovers exchanged letters, poems, and tokens in secrecy, while courtiers and peasants alike risked public censure to satisfy desires that official structures denied them. For many, the contrast between the social expectation of marital obedience and the private pursuit of pleasure created a world of duplicity, intrigue, and careful concealment. The secrecy surrounding desire extended beyond sexuality into gender itself. Cross-dressing, role-playing, and the assumption of different social identities provided ways to explore desire in societies that rigidly defined masculine and feminine behavior. Women might adopt male attire to move freely, court suitors, or engage in same-sex liaisons. Men might disguise themselves to gain access to forbidden spaces or partners. These transgressions were risky, often legally punishable, but they reveal the lengths to which people went to negotiate desire within a world of strict moral constraints. Records of trials and confessions offer the most vivid glimpses into these hidden sexual lives. Ecclesiastical courts documented acts deemed unnatural, including same-sex relations, adultery, and sexual misconduct by the clergy. These records, often sensationalized, provide a window into the clandestine behaviors that official doctrine condemned. While the language is moralistic, the details inadvertently illuminate the persistence of desire and the creativity of those who sought to satisfy it. From secret rendezvous to coded messages and letters, people found ways to live private lives that defied public norms. The tension between hidden desires and public morality also shaped literature and art. Troubadours, minstrels, and poets explored love that could not be openly expressed, crafting allegories of longing, devotion, and forbidden passion. Courtly love, often idealized as chaste and spiritual, sometimes masked real longing for physical or romantic fulfillment. Similarly, illuminated manuscripts and marginalia occasionally depict sexual humor, erotic scenes, or same-sex encounters, suggesting a fascination with desire that exceeded the boundaries of conventional morality. In these works, the imagination becomes a safe space for exploring impulses that society otherwise repressed. This hidden world was not entirely private, however. Gossip, rumor, and surveillance ensured that even secret relationships carried risks. Lovers could be discovered, punished, or publicly shamed, and the social consequences were often severe. Women were particularly vulnerable. Adultery or homosexual acts could ruin reputations and lead to exile or corporal punishment. Men faced legal prosecution, fines, or loss of status. The necessity of secrecy shaped both the behavior of lovers and the ways in which communities monitored and enforced sexual norms. Yet, despite these dangers, forbidden desires flourished. The human capacity for love, lust, and intimacy proved resilient. People found creative ways to pursue affection and erotic pleasure. Clandestine meetings, secret letters, and subtle signals allowed relationships to exist under the radar of authority. In monasteries, convents, and noble courts alike, desire persisted as a quiet but undeniable force, revealing the limits of moral control and the universality of sexual longing. Understanding these hidden lives challenges the perception of the Middle Ages as purely repressive or prudish. Desire was regulated, monitored, and morally coded, but it was never eliminated. Forbidden passions shaped private behavior, inspired art and literature, and prompted the invention of rituals, charms, and social strategies to navigate risk. In many ways, the medieval struggle between desire and repression mirrors the timeless human experience. The tension between what society permits and what the heart seeks. In this world, secrecy was both a survival mechanism and a form of resistance. Those who pursued forbidden desires navigated a landscape in which exposure could mean punishment, yet abstinence could mean frustration or emotional deprivation. The clandestine life became a negotiation with morality, social expectation, and personal longing. Lovers developed codes, relied on intermediaries, and engaged in discreet communication, inventing private systems of meaning and trust. The ingenuity of these hidden lives underscores the complexity and adaptability of human sexuality in the face of restrictive norms. Ultimately, forbidden desires remind us that medieval sexuality cannot be understood solely through law, confession manuals, or church doctrine. To grasp the lived experience, one must consider the private, often invisible lives of individuals. The nuns secretly embracing each other, the clerics defying celibacy, the married couples seeking satisfaction beyond the marital bed. These hidden worlds reveal a society in which morality and desire were in constant tension, where repression produced creativity, and where the private pursuit of intimacy endured against formidable obstacles. Medieval hidden lives also illuminate the universality of sexual experience. Despite vast differences in culture, technology, and knowledge, human longing, curiosity, and the need for affection persisted. Desire found expression in secret letters, erotic art, concealed gestures, and whispered confessions. These intimate acts, though often invisible to official history, were the heartbeat of everyday life, reminding us that sexual expression cannot be fully contained by law or doctrine. In reflecting on these hidden worlds, we see a society both rigid and flexible, moralistic and imaginative. The rules were clear, and the consequences of transgression severe. Yet human ingenuity allowed forbidden desires to survive. Intimacy, affection, and erotic pleasure existed in shadow, in coded communication, and in secret encounters, demonstrating the enduring power of desire, even in the most constrained circumstances. Forbidden desires and hidden lives, then, are central to understanding medieval sexuality. They show us the tension between public morality and private longing, between repression and creativity, between law and lived experience. They reveal a world in which desire was both dangerous and necessary, feared and cherished, forbidden and pursued. To explore these hidden lives is to glimpse the complexity, resilience, and humanity of a society navigating the eternal struggle between social expectation and personal longing. When we imagine medieval romance, the mind conjures images of shining knights, graceful ladies, and love that is pure and chaste. The reality, however, was far more nuanced. Courtly love, as it emerged in the 12th century, was an intricate social and literary construct, part admiration, part ritual, and often entirely unconscious. To truly understand medieval ideals of romance, we must explore the tension between the elevated fantasy celebrated in poetry and song, and the practical realities of life in a world governed by duty, hierarchy, and survival. Courtly love arose in the courts of France, particularly among the troubadours of Provence, who composed songs and poems celebrating longing, devotion, and the ennobling effects of desire. Knights were instructed to serve their ladies, not through conquest or coercion, but through acts of virtue, bravery, and subtle attentions. These gestures, symbolic gifts, heroic deeds, or clever words, were designed to demonstrate devotion while maintaining social propriety. The core idea was that love refined character, inspiring courage and virtue, rather than merely fulfilling physical desire. Yet courtly love was rarely consummated. The beloved, often a married noblewoman, was placed on a pedestal, admired from a distance. The unattainable nature of the love object was central. Longing was prized above satisfaction. Poems, songs, and public gestures became the primary language of affection, turning devotion into an art form rather than a straightforward human interaction. In essence, courtly love was as much performance as passion, a socially sanctioned way of expressing desire without disrupting established norms. The contrast between idealized courtly love and everyday life was stark. Marriages were typically arranged for political, economic, or dynastic reasons, leaving little room for personal affection. A noblewoman might inspire devotion from a knight, even as she navigated the obligations of a husband chosen for her by her family. Lovers had to balance secrecy, social risk, and moral scrutiny, creating a world where desire, duty, and imagination were constantly intertwined. Literature of the time illuminates this delicate dance. Troubadours and minstrels wrote extensively about unrequited love, secret meetings, and the art of flattery. These works were not merely entertainment, they served as guides to proper behavior, instructing knights in the ritual of devotion, the subtleties of admiration, and the importance of discretion. Courtly love functioned simultaneously as a social curriculum and a space for emotional expression, offering men and women a framework for navigating feelings that could not be openly acted upon. Interestingly, the dynamics of courtly love allowed women considerable influence. The admired lady controlled access, set conditions for interaction, and tested the devotion of her suitors. While men performed the visible labor of courtly love, women wielded subtle power over the social and emotional narrative, exercising agency within the rigid hierarchies of medieval society. The ritualized nature of devotion transformed longing into a socially acceptable game, where desire could be expressed and manipulated without overtly challenging conventions. Despite its refinement, courtly love was never immune to the realities of the body. Sexuality, disease, and mortality were ever present. Knights risking life and limb to serve their ladies might be wounded or killed, while women navigated pregnancies, childbirth, and the constant threat of disease. The idealized love celebrated in poetry often existed far from the grim realities of medieval life. Courtly love, for all its elegance, remained primarily imaginative and performative, a mental and emotional exercise, more than a lived experience. Secrecy was another defining feature. Many courtly relationships were extramarital, unconsummated, or entirely symbolic. Letters, poems, and discreet gestures became the currency of love, allowing emotions to be expressed while avoiding scandal. The forbidden or hidden nature of these relationships amplified desire. The unspoken often became more intense than the attainable. Medieval participants understood the delicate balance required to navigate love safely in a world of strict social and moral codes. Courtly love also influenced broader cultural norms. Chivalric behavior, courteous manners, and the cultivation of social grace were all shaped by the ideals of refined affection. Knights were expected to demonstrate courtesy, not only in combat, but in all interactions, particularly with women. Public rituals of devotion reinforced social hierarchies, gender roles, and appearances of virtue. In this way, courtly love served both personal and social functions. It provided an outlet for emotion while reinforcing order and hierarchy. However, desire could not be entirely contained within the symbolic framework. Historical records suggest that flirtation, erotic tension, and secret liaisons occasionally accompanied courtly devotion. The line between admiration and physical desire could blur, and many participants were aware of the contradictions inherent in these practices. Courtly love required constant negotiation between fantasy and reality, between the ennobling ideal and the messy corporeal truths of life. Ultimately, courtly love was a lens through which the medieval mind explored the complexities of desire, devotion, and social expectation. It celebrated longing more than fulfillment, ritual over instinct, and imagination over experience. Knights and ladies navigated a landscape where love was a game, a moral exercise, and a social performance all at once. The ideal of unattainable love both refined character and offered a sanctioned outlet for forbidden or suppressed emotions. In many ways, courtly love reveals the medieval struggle to reconcile human desire with social duty. It illustrates the creative lengths people went to in order to navigate the constraints of their world, transforming longing into literature, emotion into ritual, and passion into art. And while the elegant gestures and poetic vows may seem distant from the messy realities of medieval life, they provide a crucial window into the hopes, fears, and fantasies that colored love in an era defined by hierarchy, obligation, and the ever-present shadow of mortality. For the modern observer, courtly love is both enchanting and tragic. It reflects a society that elevated longing into virtue, that celebrated devotion, while often denying fulfillment, and that transformed human desire into a carefully choreographed performance. The ideals of courtly love were, in many ways, as unattainable as the women upon their pedestals, leaving a bittersweet legacy of romance that was as much about imagination and restraint as it was about the heart itself. If love was ritualized in the Middle Ages, then life itself was even more so, framed by forces far larger than the individual. Every romance, every marriage, every whispered exchange beneath the stars, carried with it an unavoidable shadow: childbirth, death, and the ever-present reminder of human fragility. To understand the end result of love in medieval society, we must step beyond the poetry of the troubadours and into the hard realities of the human body. For medieval women, love and marriage almost always culminated in childbirth. Unlike the refined ideals of courtly devotion, this was not a matter of choice or imagination, it was duty. Bearing children ensured the continuation of a family's line, strengthened alliances, and secured the transmission of wealth and property. Whether noble or peasant, women were expected to bring new life into the world. Yet what seems so natural to us today was, in that era, profoundly dangerous. Childbirth was one of the most perilous experiences a woman could face. Without modern medicine, antiseptics, or reliable surgical techniques, complications were frequent and often fatal. Hemorrhage, obstructed labor, puerperal fever, or infections could claim both mother and infant within hours. Even for women of wealth, no physician could guarantee survival. Midwives were the guardians of this process, bringing with them herbs, prayers, charms, and experience, but ultimately little power against nature's risks. For noble women, the chamber of childbirth became both a place of hope and dread, a ritual, steeped in religious invocation, where every cry of labor was accompanied by whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary. For men, too, childbirth was transformative, though from a distance. Fathers had little role in the birthing chamber, which was a female-dominated space, yet the outcome determined dynasties, inheritance, and political alliances. The birth of a son might secure the family's legacy, while the death of mother or child could unravel years of careful planning. In this sense, childbirth was not merely a personal event, but a public and political one, woven into the fabric of medieval society. The risks of death and childbirth reflected a larger truth of the Middle Ages. Mortality was constant, intimate, and unavoidable. Life expectancy was short, particularly for women and children. Many infants did not survive their first year. Plagues, famines, accidents, and wars cut down lives indiscriminately. For a society steeped in religion, death was not only inevitable, but central to the human experience. Every church, every monastery, every graveyard, whispered the same lesson: that earthly life was brief, fragile, and always in the hands of God. This omnipresence of death shaped love itself. A husband and wife might grow close, bound by shared struggles, yet always aware of the possibility of sudden loss. Courtly devotion, with its emphasis on longing and unattainable desire, echoed this reality in its own way. Love was fleeting, fragile, often unfulfilled, always shadowed by the specter of separation. To love in the Middle Ages was, at its core, to accept uncertainty. Medieval rituals surrounding death reinforced this awareness. Funerals were deeply symbolic, blending grief with religious hope. The soul, it was believed, passed into the care of God, while the living were reminded to prepare for their own eventual judgment. Widows and widowers often remarried quickly, not always out of lack of affection, but because survival demanded it. Children needed parents, estates required guardians, alliances had to be maintained. In this way, love and loss were entwined, one following swiftly upon the heels of the other. We must not imagine, however, that medieval people lived without joy or deep affection. Love persisted in spite of danger. Parents cherished their children, couples found comfort in one another, and songs of devotion continued to echo through great halls and village squares. But unlike in modern life, love could not be taken for granted. Every embrace carried the knowledge that it might be the last. Every birth was a miracle tinged with risk, and every promise of devotion was framed by the inevitability of death. The end result of love in medieval society was therefore not simply marriage or childbirth, but an ongoing cycle of creation and loss. Desire might inspire poetry, but duty created families. Families, in turn, were bound to the rhythms of survival, birth, growth, death, and the continuity of lineage. And at every stage, faith provided meaning. Whether through prayers in childbirth, blessings at weddings, or rituals at funerals, the Church gave structure to the uncertainties of life, offering hope where reason and medicine could not. When we look back at medieval love, it is tempting to focus on the romance of it, the troubadours, the gallant knights, the secret letters slipped beneath doors. Yet beneath these ideals lay a far more sobering truth, that love was inseparable from vulnerability. To love was to risk, and to risk was to suffer. In this way, medieval love was not so different from our own. It was fragile, it was hopeful, and it was shaped by the limits of human mortality. And so, as we close our journey through the rituals, ideals, and realities of love in the Middle Ages, we are left with this understanding. Courtly gestures and poetic vows were only one part of the story. The true measure of love was found in the endurance of families, in the survival of children, and in the resilience of the human heart against the ever-present shadow of death. Love, in the end, was not simply a feeling. It was a duty, a risk, a ritual, and a hope. It was the thread that bound together the fragile lives of men and women in a world where tomorrow was never promised. Courtly or common, noble or humble, Love carried them forward even as it reminded them always of the fragility of life and the certainty of its end. And so, we have reached the end of our journey through the medieval bedchamber, through its rules and rituals, its sins and superstitions, its tenderness and its tragedies. What began with the Church's stern hand and the endless weight of sin has taken us through the obligations of marriage, the strange and desperate search for birth control, the dangers of adultery, the contradictions of prostitution, the filth of daily life, the mysteries of superstition, the hidden desires whispered in shadow, the fantasies of courtly love, and finally, the harsh realities of childbirth and death. If we peel back the romantic haze that Hollywood so often drapes over the Middle Ages, what we find is far less glamorous and far more human. Love was rarely free, rarely simple, and rarely without risk. It was regulated by the Church, constrained by society, complicated by superstition, and overshadowed by mortality. And yet amid the dirt, the danger, and the fear, love still endured. Couples found joy where they could. Songs were sung, vows were spoken, hands were held in the dark. Even in an age where everything was shadowed by sin and death, the human heart still reached out for connection. That, perhaps, is the most enduring truth of all. Love in the Middle Ages may have been disgusting, difficult, and dangerous, but it was also undeniably real. And now I'll turn the question over to you. After hearing the strange, grim, and fascinating truths of medieval sex and love, which part shocked you the most? Was it the strange superstitions, the Church's endless rules, or the brutal realities of childbirth? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive into history's stranger side, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell because there are many more hidden truths from the past waiting to be uncovered. After all, history isn't always noble battles and great kings. Sometimes, it's about the intimate, the personal, and yes, the disgusting.